you. Thank you for being here today. There was a discussion about the use of levelised cost of energy as distinct from using the total system cost and the benefits of and detriments of that in some of the earlier witnesses' testimony. Were you present or listening to that?
No, I wasn't here for that.
Okay, perhaps taking a step back then, do you have any observations or thoughts on the benefits of each of those measurements and the utility of each of those measurements in terms of the provision of energy in Australia?
I think, Senator, the levelised cost of energy is a tool used to be able to compare different technologies. So I think those gen cost numbers that are produced help you to kind of understand the different costs. So the levelised cost is the amount you need to recover all of your capital and current costs over the life of that generation asset. So that helps you to understand different costs of different technologies. But if you're looking at an optimisation model, for example, like the ISP, you'd look more at capital costs and then you optimise across other costs of that technology. So different measures have different uses, and I think that levelised cost measure really helps you to make the comparisons.
For achieving objectives of reliability, minimising price and meeting Australia's emissions reduction targets, there seems to have been a philosophical debate that's emerged out of some of the evidence today that compares a model that uses ever-increasing intermittent or renewable sources of energy with a firming source, for instance like gas, or a reversion to a baseload-focused model to ensure the economics of large-scale baseload infrastructure. In terms of achieving those objectives, do you have a view about which is optimal?
So, Senator, again, I mean, you ran through some of the choices that you need to make in terms of how you determine what's optimal. So reliability, security, affordability, and achieving emissions reduction goals. They're all important things. They're all the things, again, that, in a sense, constrain the AEMO's modelling through the integrated system plan. And so, in terms of what's the lowest cost system generation mix that leads you to achieving and solving for all of those different issues, the most authoritative source that we have is the integrated system plan, which would talk to what you described, which is a combination of firmed renewable energy, where the firming comes from, effectively, you've got VRE, you've got storage through batteries, and then firming through some combination of pumped hydro, gas, and while it remains in the system, of course, coal-fired power generation remains very important for us. Over time, you would expect that technology shift to continue more towards the firmed renewables, which shifts you more towards, as I said, renewable energy, storage and firming, but as I said, with pumped hydro and gas playing a significant role.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Senator Pocock.
Thank you very much, Chair.
You've got a short block.
Thank you. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I've got some questions about emissions and technology modelling of the electricity market. It looks as though there was a prediction that emissions from the electricity sector was projected to fall by about 12 million tonnes per annum in the year 2023-24, but that projection was out by about 10 million tonnes. Is that correct?
So, Senator, you have us at a bit of a disadvantage. The emissions projections are done by the Climate Change Group in our department. We don't have any of those colleagues here with us today. But we can take that one on notice for you and come back.
Sure. And if that is the case, just on notice to why such a significant error in the projections. I'll put the rest of them on notice. One issue that's been raised in multiple submissions, including from RMIT and UTS, is that there's no clear definition of energy consumer. in the various laws that govern the energy market. They argue that this causes confusion and has contributed to the development of a complex and at times problematic system. Why isn't there a single clear definition of energy consumer?
I don't know whether any of my colleagues have anything to contribute on that.
Yes, I don't. I'm not sure we would know why that wasn't defined, but we could take it on notice to see if there's records that explain
Who would know?
that choice.
It sort of seems fundamental to me. We hear so much about prices and the consumer, but no one's actually defined what that is.
Yeah, so Senator, we typically, I mean, when we think about our advice to government around different policies, we think more around the componentry of what an energy consumer is. So we think about how we can support households in the energy transition, how we can support business in the energy transition. In terms then of what a definition would be, and I presume I haven't read the submission, but I presume this is specifically in a regulatory context. So that's one we'll need to take on notice just to understand the nature of the question to be able to provide you with a good answer.
That'd be great. It seems to me like the regulatory system is working for everyone except the actual people it should be working for. Just to ask some questions about the AEMC. Do you accept that the rule change process through AEMC is inflexible?
Yeah, so I think, Senator, so the AEMC, my observation of them is that they are very responsive to rule change requests from wherever they may come from. I mean, they have quite rigorous processes, quite rightly, that they go through in terms of consultation. Those consultation timeframes take time to ensure that the ultimate rule change, should it succeed in that process, is one that is fit for purpose. And so, yeah, I think they're flexible and responsive to the demand, but then I think the actual process they go through, quite rightly, is rigorous in its application.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me, and we covered this on a previous day of hearings, this tension between complex and lengthy rule changes has led to some states legislating jurisdictional derogations and some of the complications that causes, where you have states sort of doing their own thing within the NEM. Is that an issue in your?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, for all the reasons why, it makes a lot of sense to have a national electricity market, consistency of rules, consistency of approaches, to provide, frankly, consistency of frameworks for investors in particular to grapple with, but also consumers, as you point out. So I think certainly, the best system is one where we had a clear and transparent set of rules that apply equally across state borders. I think that's right. I don't know, the examples that I've been associated with where states have taken the decision to derogate. It's not so much a concern about the timeframe or robustness of an AEMC consultation process. It's a different perspective for that jurisdiction in terms of what that jurisdiction-specific needs are on that topic. And so, each jurisdiction with its own geography has its own set of challenges, and there will be times where, in trying to find consensus in the NEM, a jurisdiction will take the view that where the consensus is heading is not fit for purpose for them. So that's more the sort of scenario that we see, rather than a specific concern with the AEMC's rule change process per se.
And given you've talked about the need for consistency and some of the challenges that come from states reclaiming a variety of roles in managing their jurisdictional electricity systems, what's the department doing about this issue?
So what I would say is that through the Energy and Climate Ministerial Council, and underpinning that is the National Energy Transformation Partnership, we are driving to ensure consistency of priority as we, I guess the Commonwealth Government supports the state governments in managing their way through the energy transition. So understanding priorities, and then below that there's a very significant working group structure for senior officials, which each jurisdiction contributes to. the development of policies that then ultimately are recommended to the Energy and Climate Ministerial Council. So all jurisdictions have the opportunity to contribute. The aim is to ensure that everyone's views are taken into account so that by the time you get to the end, every jurisdiction is able to sign up to the recommendation. Now, as I said, there are a few examples of where that doesn't occur for very specific reasons for specific jurisdictions, but I'd call them more the exception rather than being the norm.
Okay, so that all the work's happening through the Ministerial Council. But is this lack of harmonisation between jurisdictions because of jurisdictional derogations a challenge for the task of decarbonisation at a national level, given we have the national climate legislation?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I can't think of an example yet where I would say it has been so significantly at odds that it's become one of the major impediments, one of the major challenges. I think the examples that there have been thus far, I think, obviously, had we been able to achieve a consensus across the NEM, that would have put us in a better position. But I don't think we're in a materially worse position for not having achieved it, would be my assessment.
And I think, Senator, also when you're thinking of some of the recent derogations, in particular because states and territories notify other states when they intend to make a derogation from the national electricity rules. Mm-hmm. So thinking back over the past year, that hasn't been a frequent occurrence, and most recently related to Queensland's enactment of their Jobs and Energy Plan, and actually Queensland adopting its own targets and pathways, in some ways with the intention of progressing the decarbonisation of the Queensland grid, putting in place specific measures that deal with some of the commitments of the Queensland state government in relation to their state-owned electricity assets. So I think on a case-by-case basis, some derogations are to advance the decarbonisation of specific markets, and others, as you say, perhaps can be less positive. And in some of those sort of areas, the Commonwealth does seek to play a leadership role. So particularly, for example, in actions like implementation of the CER roadmap, where there are really important issues where national consistency matters. So you don't want to have sort of railway gauge issues. Devices need to be interoperable, and we need to ensure in Australia that, mum's EV and dad's EV both plug into a charger that's the same. So we don't obviously want to be in a situation where the devices won't work together across the country. So in those circumstances, the Commonwealth is leading in to lead through the National Energy Transformation Partnership to ensure that we're working together in the best interests of Australian consumers.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm getting at is who is driving the task of decarbonising the electricity sector? Are we just leaving this to the Ministerial Council, or is there other work happening?
No, it's a good question, Senator. So the way I'd describe it is the Commonwealth has set the ambition. So 43% emissions reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. That ambition, when we looked at, for example, the 82% renewable energy target in 2030, prior to some of the recent interventions from the government, the states the combination of their targets would have taken us somewhere around 67%. So they had existing energy planning in place that would have delivered 67% renewables. Now, that was essentially the basis on which the advice to government around the need for an additional set of instruments, one of those being the capacity investment scheme to take us from 67 through to 83%, 32 gigawatts of new generation and storage capacity in order to lift. But in doing that, what we needed was the states to maintain their effort, and so the counterpart instrument for us is renewable energy transformation agreements, so bilateral agreements between the Commonwealth and each individual state, where they commit to continuing to do the things that they had intended to do in order to reach 67 on average, and so that the Commonwealth's additional investment through the capacity investment scheme is truly additional and takes us through to 82. So it's really, the combination at the national level, rule setting through the National Energy Transformation Partnership, all the working groups, but then supported by these bilateral agreements that deliver on the ambition of 82%.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Given the complexity of all this, we sit through days of listening to experts try and unpack what's happening in the energy market and regulation. What are you doing to ensure that this complexity isn't a barrier for consumers, energy groups, and even local governments to participate in the energy market?
Yeah. So Senator, there is a big task in a sense, demystifying and turning something which is quite complex at the system level into something quite approachable for the individual consumer. So there are a range of tools that exist. I mean, you'll be aware of the Energy Made Easy website, for example, an opportunity for consumers to learn about the energy system but also understand how they interact with it. I'd just say, Senator, I think this is an area where it's sort of the job's never going to really be done in terms of communicating simply, easily to consumers and making sure that they are as well placed to be, the key beneficiaries of the energy transition. I think this is going to require attention from policymakers all the way through the transition.
How many hits have you had on this Energy Made Easy website?
So that's, I understand it's administered by the Australian Energy Regulator, so we'll have to take on notice and ask them, Senator, how many hits they've had.
Great. I'll chuck a few more on notice. Thanks, Chair.
We might get back to others. Just thought we'd share it around. Mr. Duggan, thank you for appearing again. Very much appreciated. As you know, this inquiry was stood up largely to look at both effectiveness and governance of our the Australian energy system. It's through the testimony we've had and things that we've learned earlier, including through estimates. I'm concerned, as a federal parliamentarian, that the federal government's being pulled into a vortex that may not serve the taxpayer of Australia all that well. And certainly also there's been plenty of concerns expressed about the benefit to energy users across the country for increasing costs, etc. What is, just to set the scene, can you tell me what the department's role is in that?
Yeah.
Briefly.
So, thank you, Chair. Effectively, for all the reasons that we've just discussed, I mean, the governance, the overall governance of the energy transition in Australia occurs through the Energy and Climate Ministerial Council, which Minister Bowen chairs as the Commonwealth Minister for Energy and Climate Change. So we support Minister Bowen in that role. In that capacity, I have a particular role, which is to be the chair of the senior officials group that sits below it. And below that is a range of working groups that align with the priorities that ministers have established in terms of the focus of governments in driving the transition that we're seeing in the energy sector. So there's there's a Commonwealth state governance architecture that sits below all of this. And then in addition to that, as you know, we have market bodies established.
Yeah, no, it's just more inquiring about the role of the department, and assume you provide advice to the minister. Where you're seeing changes that might be needed, etc. Yeah.
So the advice that we provide to the minister is in accordance with all the objectives around ensuring that we have an energy system that works for the users of energy. So, of course, managing the transition to cleaner energy technologies in line with the emissions reduction objectives of the government is a focus, but alongside, of course, reliability, stability of the energy system, affordability, being absolutely prominent. So with all of those objectives, providing advice to the government where we see opportunities for the Commonwealth to be engaging in ways that promote each of those objectives. Now, a lot of the time, actually, the states will have the levers, and so part of that engagement is working with and through the states to think about what instruments they can bring to solving the challenges along the way, and what instruments and comparative advantages the Commonwealth will bring. So each of us is doing what we're best equipped to do.
And briefly, do you measure progress or success against those things?
Yeah, so we certainly with respect to each of those individual metrics or individual objectives, we are very attentive to looking at the data and the evidence for how things are tracking, and that gives us an insight into where areas where we may need to put more priority focus over time. So, as I mentioned before, a couple of years ago, it was pretty evident to us that the emissions reduction objective that the government had been set wasn't going to be achieved on the basis of the existing state planning, the existing Commonwealth government instruments, and therefore we provided advice around what were the options or choices that the government faced in order to be able to do that. So, just one example.
Sure, thank you. And we've heard that in estimates before. And heads up, when it comes to measurement, I might put some more questions to you next week about what that measurement looks like. But it seems on the evidence that what we're seeing that the transition to a low-no emissions economy is faltering. That the ISP isn't delivering on the things that it said it was going to do on behalf of the Commonwealth and the states. And I think some of the evidence for that, and I can take you through some of the reasons, we can get into the weeds of the ISP about why. But the fact that the Commonwealth government has had to come up with the rewiring the nation policy is a key one. The other major one, I think, is the capacity investment scheme. They're Commonwealth coming up with solutions to problems that the ISP should have remedied. And there's no evidence that it was or ever could remedy those. And the Commonwealth has had to step in with its balance sheet and try and solve these problems.
So the way I describe it, Chair, is that the market is transitioning. It's largely commercial incentives that are driving the changes that we're seeing in the energy market. But the Commonwealth Government's emissions reduction targets, in order to achieve those, require an acceleration beyond which there is currently the commercial incentive to deliver. And so what the capacity investment scheme, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So the capacity investment scheme, one of its objectives is to provide more certainty around the future revenue stream of a new renewable energy project or a new storage project, in the context of a lot of uncertainty about when the capacity that it may ultimately replace, so in this case coal-fired power generation, what the closure schedule of that capacity would be. So that's a very important variable when you're sitting down to make a renewable energy. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and for many of the renewable energy potential investors, it's very difficult. It's unknowable because there's lots there that you can't see based on public information. So, in a sense, you're providing for an acceleration and you're correcting for some information gaps that de-risk those investments in order to achieve the acceleration that's needed to go, as I said, from what the commercial incentives would have led to what the government has set in terms of emissions reduction targets in order to achieve its Paris commitments. So it is an acceleration on what would otherwise have been achieved, and that requires a degree of intervention in order to achieve it.
But that's also the ISP's job, isn't it, to send those signals, and particularly, let's just look at one, transmission. I think it's fair to say, and we've had plenty of evidence, that the ISP isn't an integrated system plan. It's a transmission planning document which sets out a least cost pathway to develop a set of transmission projects.
So I think, obviously, Chair, you know the ISP in quite a bit of detail, so you'd know that it also, in addition to transmission, it also steps through the different generation technology potential pathways.
So let me address that. Yes, it does talk about them in no more certain terms than you and I having a conversation about them. It doesn't plan for them in any meaningful way. The only thing it plans for is transmission. There is nothing else that says, here are actionable projects. And in fact, if I can hold it up, all the actionable projects, and the only inputs into the candidate development paths that go into the optimal development path, which is then the plan that's taken forward, is only transmission projects. For example, there's no, doesn't model more or less generation, more or less wind or solar, the effect of storage would have on the amount of generation or transmission that's needed. Doesn't do any of those.
Yeah. So, Chair, I'll hand to my colleague in just a moment. I mean, one thing, of course, what the ISP contributes to through defining what an actionable project is, it then contributes, of course, to the next step in a regulatory process that recognises that specifically for transmission, there is a market power element there which requires then a regulatory approach to how you then provide the revenue base for that market power. So, in a sense, the ISP is a feed-in with respect specifically to transmission. It needs to get to the point of identifying what potentially an actionable project is for testing by the proponent under the RIP-T, which I think of as being categorically different to then a generation, potentially the role the ISP plays in identifying the total generation capacity choices that you face under different technology outlooks. But, I mean, Ms Gowans knows this stuff very well. Is there anything you'd add?
I think I'm just, contemplating your question, which I think is a really important question, goes to the heart of what is the integrated system plan for. And in that respect, I go back to the fact that it is a policy and information tool for market participants and governments who are planning in an environment of uncertainty. So it does have a critical role in respect of transmission planning, and of course AEMO has a transmission planning function under the National Electricity Law. It's part of the function of AEMO.
No, that's all given and all matter of law.
Yes, but it does start from that question of the system need. So the integrated system plan starts by saying what is the system as a whole, what is the system that we need. So, for example, it models the amount of demand that it's expected and therefore the matching amount of supply. It models the cost of the different options to meet that supply. And then ultimately, as you say, at the end of that process, what comes out of it is the way that you will connect the demand and the supply together, which in many cases is transmission.
Only in
yes,
some.
Not in all cases, but ultimately you do need your electricity to get to market. So you do need your electricity to travel from the place where it's generated to the places where it's consumed, and transmission and distribution play that function in our electricity system.
Yes, but it's not the only role. For example, rooftop solar doesn't need transmission.
But does need distribution.
Only if you don't store it in a battery. So, but none of that's planned for. None of that's actually planned for. All that's planned for is transmission, which, I put to you that the NEM is probably the greatest provider of productivity in the country. As a single entity, if you could call it. Yet none of the planning that's done in the ISP or anywhere else that I can find is done on an economic basis. The ISP is done on we might need it, and what's the cost of it, or what's the least cost of it to get there. But there's no economic analysis of that need. There's no analysis of whether a mixture of storage and solar is better than wind and transmission or whatever. None of that's modelled. It only turns out one particular product. It's like a biscuit factory that turns out biscuits, nothing more, which is fine if that's all you are and you're being honest. But given the amount of, I won't say transparency because AEMO is very transparent, but as we've heard today, it's not very accountable, because you get to see the inputs and you are given an output, but you can't see any of the workings, what's gone into derive that output. It's a black box where a whole lot gets shoveled in and you get a nice pretty document at the end that says more transmission. And this is, that would be fine, but then the Commonwealth is being asked to come in and solve the transmission problem by having to put up $20 billion for more transmission. So I just worry that as a Commonwealth, states have their own things, and they're changing things by putting in their own derogations, as we discussed before. But I just worry the Commonwealth is being led down a path that we're not going to recover out of.
So I accept the point that you're making on one level, but I mean on another level, and I know, I mean, you're very familiar with this, which is that in a sense what the ISP is doing is getting to the point of identifying what is an actionable project. There's a lot that then transpires, as you know, through the RIT-T process to then challenge that project against the alternatives for delivering the same system service. And in that context, look to ensure that it provides it at the lowest ultimate cost to consumers. So then what's supported ultimately by the Commonwealth Government through Rewiring the Nation will have gone through that process to then determine that what may have started in the ISP as an actionable project has gone through a rigorous process before it's then assessed as being the best method of providing the system service that we need.
Yes,
and then Rewiring the Nation is just reducing the cost to consumers of that option.
I don't necessarily agree, because a RIT-T test is in effect, it's just checking lowest cost, against the ISP. It's it's almost like a self-reinforcing process.
I wouldn't quite accept that it's just checking the process against the ISP. So the integrated system plan, when a project is actionable, triggers the commencement of a RIT-T.
Yes.
But a RIT-T requires the transmission network service provider to come up with a range of different options to deliver that same outcome, and they can include obviously non-network options as well as network options. And that process of testing the various options through the consultation report and then the final report is designed to ensure that that option is the one that stacks up in the long-term interests of consumers.
That's a very good point when you talk about non-networked options. There is no driver for them to actually put forward realistic non-network options. And there, in the ISP path, there is no non-network options that are put forward as alternatives. So the proponents have little or no incentive to put non-network options in there. Have a look at the BNI West PADR. It's given such short shrift. It's embarrassing.
We can provide more on notice about this, but there is a requirement to provide non-network options or present non-network options as part of the RIT-T.
And then dismiss them.
I couldn't comment on whether they're then dismissed. It is a requirement of the RIT-T that non-network options are put forward and evaluated as a part of the assessment of which is the best way of delivering that outcome for the national electricity market.
Given that none of this is assessed on an economic basis, don't you think that we're now at a point and where we're seeing states having to go off on their own and do their own things, that the experiment's kind of done and dusted? It's about time to start looking at where we go to next with this process and trying to come up with a better planning process, a more complete one that delivers on our transition to net zero. I mean, for example, the national electricity objectives set a emissions reduction target. The ISP only models an amount of a percentage of renewables. They're not the same thing. So there's just some inbuilt problems which are being papered over by a lack of accountability. I think the states and the Commonwealth are starting to see issues arising with this that are only going to cause you and your minister problems down the track, as opposed to AEMO.
Yeah. So I'll just make two comments in response to that, Chair. One is So no sooner do they finish an ISP than they start the process for the next ISP. So AEMO is currently gearing up to do the 2026 ISP. As part of that, as you know, they go through quite an extensive process of consultation around what they're planning, what they're proposing to do in that context, and they make improvements, refinements over time on the basis of that consultation. Second point I'd make is that we also have a role to play here. Periodically there is a review done of the ISP. We completed a review within the past 12 months. We provided advice on that through to energy ministers. Energy ministers effectively agreed with that advice, and now we've got rule change requests in to make improvements to the ISP. So it's not a static document, it's a document that we seek to strengthen and improve over time. And so this is it's a fast-moving environment, lots of different perspectives being brought to bear on it. So I personally have confidence in AEMO to take on board the feedback that they get, and if I had a concern, if I had a particular perspective on it, I'd express it to AEMO as one of the government shareholders, and I'd anticipate that they would listen and they would respond to that.
But who's holding them to account? Because none of the things they say they're going to achieve are being achieved.
Yeah. So ultimately, this falls into the category of things that are AEMO statutory functions, and so ultimately for their statutory functions they are accountable to the energy and climate ministers. And so they report to us every 6 months on progress against their priorities. We have a statement of expectations with AEMO that we set around what we ask them to do as governments, and we do monitor their progress, and we do make an assessment as to whether or not we require changes or further interventions.
I'll leave it there, but can I ask you to put those reports that AEMO give you every 6 months, if you would take that on notice or table them next week?
I'll do that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Canavan.
Thanks. Just returning to these power prices issues. I have looked at this before. This Global Petrol Prices website publishes prices. They say that our prices, household prices in Australia, average 26.3 US cents per kilowatt hour. Where do you get your 17 cents from?
So, Senator, during which period are you?
2024.
2024. So
2023. I got 2023. It was 21 cents, and 2022 it's 23 cents.
Yeah. So I was referring to 2021 data, and and it's because you're comparing across countries. We were putting in standardised US dollar terms across all those different countries. So
have you got figures, say, for the last couple of years?
We don't have that comparison for most recent years.
Is there any reason we're not doing that? Or, there seems to be some data available.
Yeah, there's no particular reason, but we just don't have it.
We can take on notice, Senator, and come back to you with the most
probably a bit
recent
embarrassing because they are quite high. We've actually got the 11th highest in the developed world, and all the countries above us are all in Europe. I'm not sure we'd want to be comparing ourselves to them. Is there anywhere in the world you can point to that has adopted or increased its share of solar and wind electricity to a substantial degree and has lowered their electricity prices as a result?
Yeah. So certainly we are not alone in the countries that are seeking to use increased solar and wind, and we will need to look and do a cross-comparison. I don't have the matrix of who's increasing solar and wind and what's happened to their prices on hand, Senator, so I'll need to take that.
So there's no country you can identify. The problem here is you can only ignore reality for so long. The reality is almost every country I can see that's increased its share of solar and wind significantly, especially those in Europe, has ended up with much higher power prices.
So, Senator, the point I'd make is that there are a lot of factors that go into power prices. In Europe at the moment, of course, those that are reliant in any way on gas are paying much higher power prices than they were previously due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, I think this isn't an answer that I want to give to you superficially, Senator. I think if we can take this on notice and we can give you an actual assessment of what the drivers are of that, I think you'd be much better informed.
How much is the capacity investment scheme going to cost taxpayers?
Yeah, so Senator, in the budget papers, it's noted that it sits as a contingent liability for the Commonwealth, but the total cost isn't disclosed, and there's very good commercial reasons for that, which are we publish the amount of generation capacity that we're seeking, which is the 32 gigawatts. Were we to publish the cost, effectively we would undermine the competitiveness of the auctions, because we would essentially be giving a sense of what the average price per kilowatt was.
But it means the Australian people don't know. It's their dollars that are being put at risk.
Yeah, and again, I'd say, Senator, what would be, it would be challenging, and in fact we wouldn't be putting the Australian taxpayer in a very good position if we were to, in a sense, prejudice the outcomes of tender arrangements because we revealed what the Commonwealth was prepared to pay. We need those tenders to be as competitive as possible to drive the lowest possible prices.
Similar to the electricity price, seems like the government doesn't want to publish information that is potentially embarrassing to it. I mean, do you expect the extra investments from the capacity investment scheme to push wholesale electricity prices down or up?
Yeah, so, Senator, when we did the analysis that informed the decision that the government made around the capacity investment scheme, we did that on the basis of an expectation that the more low-cost renewable energy you get into the system, and getting that into the system prior to 2030, while we still have a fair bit of generation capacity from other sources, the more supply you get in, the lower the prices will be ultimately.
So under the capacity investment scheme, though, when those prices go down, the cost will go up because you're underwriting the investments, right? So you'll have to then potentially trigger the payments under the capacity investment scheme to the proponents.
Yeah, one way of thinking about that, Senator, is it's a natural hedge. Like if electricity prices fall to very low levels in Australia, then yes, in a sense, the taxpayer will then be underwriting.
So how do you define very low levels? When do these payments kick in?
So it's different for every contract. So each proponent bids in at a floor price, and so for each contract that's written, we only provide the revenue underwriting that is necessary.
So have you got a ceiling on the floor price, so to speak?
Yeah, so the way the option, it's effectively a collar arrangement.
Right.
And so the Commonwealth Government takes 90% of the downside revenue risk below the floor, and then we share 50%.
What I'm sort of asking, have you got a reserve? Like if someone tries to bid a floor price above a certain level, we say, no, we're not taking that. That's too much cost to the Australian people.
So there's there's a financial value assessment, but really it's a relative assessment. What we've found is that we've got sufficient...
I know we've got really limited time. Apparently you guys can't stay. Just quickly, I mean, I'm not sure, maybe you can't understand my question. Please tell me if you can't. But is there a price above which you will not take a contract? Has the government set a reserve?
No, Senator.
Thank you.
That is within.
Okay.
That is competitively determined within the.
So it's quite different from my understanding of the offshore wind auctions in the UK, where there is such a reserve price, so to speak.
Yep.
All right. So uncapped risk to the taxpayer. Just on data centres, what work are you doing there? 'Cause it seems to me AEMO aren't doing, and the ISP doesn't really consider this. Are you looking at the increased energy demands from data centres, and what does that show?
Yeah, so we are, Senator. So this is potentially a new source of very significant demand on the electricity grid, and so we are looking very carefully at what the implications of that increase in demand would be, and thinking very carefully about what sort of rules or what sort of regulatory arrangements you might want to put around them. So in some cases, we've seen overseas that governments have, for example, required those to be off-grid so that they're meeting their own electricity needs without drawing down on the grid. In other cases, that's not the case. They do draw on the grid, but they do so on the basis of investing in new renewable energy. So there are different policy choices to be made. So we're attentive to the issue and considering the best way to respond.
Have you met with Google or Amazon or Microsoft, the large users of data centres, and recently to discuss these issues? I
haven't personally met with any of them.
I don't mean you personally, sorry, but anyone from the department?
Yeah, so we have. I am aware of people in the department meeting with proponents of large data centres.
Have they? Sorry, feel free to.
I was going to answer yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Thank you. Have you discussed with them why those companies are choosing nuclear energy to power their data centres overseas?
It's not something they've raised with us, Senator. No.
No, but if you asked them. I mean, no.
No, it's not a question we put.
Don't ask, don't know, can't tell. Fair enough. But they are. I mean, it's very public. I'm sure you're aware that all of those companies I mentioned, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, are all recently announced large-scale contracts or the prospect of future contracts with nuclear energy to meet their data centre needs. Are you at all looking into that? Have you yourselves investigated why that phenomenon is occurring?
So I'm aware that it's occurring, Senator. In Australia, the current legislative and legal frameworks don't reveal that as an option, so it's not a conversation that we have.
I mean, the problem seems to be here that when I speak to people who construct data centres, they need a remarkable level of energy reliability, much, much greater than even an aluminium smelter or the most heavy industry in this country. Have you, at this stage, looked at, is solar and wind renewables, how hard you firm it, an appropriate energy source for a sort of load that needs that much reliability? Is there that much risk of a power interruption?
So, Senator, I mean, the nature of these conversations isn't really us seeking to... It's not really us seeking to solve, for their energy needs. It's really to understand...
Can I just get you to repeat that? Sorry, the Chair was asking me something.
So the nature of the discussions that we've had with data centres, or at least the ones I participated in, have not been us proactively seeking to solve a data centre's energy need. More, it's the data centre coming to us, the potential proponent of a data centre, to understand the Australian policy framework around energy, to then make that next consideration about what they would need to do in the Australian context in order to provide whatever, the reliability, the security and the amount of energy that they would need for their data centre.
So you've done no work. I mean, when I speak to them, they have provisions in their contract. If they lose power for 5 minutes, they'll lose massive amounts of revenue, like a year's revenue. And they tell me openly, I'm surprised they haven't told you, there's no way we're going to power this with intermittent renewables. It's just not going to work. They have to have reliable power. And obviously that's why those companies are going to nuclear energy. In Asia, they're being built with coal. I mean, this is a massive national security issue for our country, because if we don't have the type of power needed to meet that load, that data necessarily that we need and use is going to have to be stored overseas. So I'm just trying to get to the bottom of, have you looked at in detail, are you working with the Department of Defence or anybody in detail about what are the load requirements of a data centre, and does that match our current pathway for electricity supply?
So our current pathway on electricity supply is guided by some very strict energy reliability, electricity reliability benchmarks. I mean, it's at 99.999998% in terms of the unserved energy usage. So it is an incredibly high standard by international standards.
But it's also true that in the latest ESU, those standards are breached within the next few years in New South Wales and Victoria. Is that right?
So the ESU provides an investment signal. So one way to interpret the ESU is it provides a signal to investors about where there is the opportunity to invest into the grid.
Is it breached? It's breached. We're not on track to meet those, according to AEMO, in the next few years in New South Wales and Victoria. Is that right?
So we would require one of two things to occur. Either we would require the additional investment that I just referred to in responding to that investment signal, or AEMO also has a range of powers that it can utilise in order to ensure that if we get to that point, that the reliability standard is met.
Big security issue for us. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator, I'll just finish off very quickly with a couple more questions. Is it fair to say that that the AEMO schedule of coal plant retirement will not be met?
So again, I heard the evidence given by AEMO on this point, and I think they drew the distinction between the announced schedule by the asset owners of those coal-fired power stations and what their modelling would suggest in terms of how much of the existing coal generation capacity may leave the market by 2035. And so I think the figure they referred to was broadly 90% of the existing capacity could exit the market on that scenario under the ISP. So I think they also described it as a modelled scenario, consistent with all the assumptions that go into it. It's not a prediction. There's no policy that delivers that as a specific outcome. It's simply the result of their modelling exercise.
And this is the point. It seems to me the failures of the ISP mean that they won't be able to let it go. And as we've seen with the New South Wales government contracting a raring to stay in, I think we're going to see more and more of that, aren't we? The numbers in the just in the ISP step change that AEMO have. 2030 is 196.9 gigawatts of wind, utility and solar capacity. It's an awfully big number, awfully bigger than the 24 gigawatt of coal that's out there.
Yeah.
And it only gets bigger from there out to 2050. How are we, building that much generation, putting all our eggs in a transmission basket, and can't solve the thing that I think Australians want us to achieve most, which is decarbonising the electricity grid?
Yeah.
It is, in fact, the lowest hanging fruit in the Australian economy in terms of decarbonising. If you need to decarbonise one industry, the easiest one's going to be electricity. Yet we're going to fail that, aren't we?
So, Chair, one of the additional data points to put into what you just described is the significant projection around the increase in electricity demand that we're likely to see going forward for two reasons: economic growth, but secondly, because of the decarbonisation pathway for many sectors in the economy is through electrification. So when we think about what's the gross electricity demand need, it's on a rising base. So when we think about what's required, we're going to have effectively a doubling of electricity demand over the next decade. We're going to need a tripling of renewable energy in order to hit the government's targets in that regard. That is a very big expansion of our generation capacity, new generation capacity that's required, undoubtedly. But as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing very significant amounts of investment, very significant pipelines starting to come through now, which gives us some confidence that we're at the early stages of that acceleration that we're going to need.
If we accept that as right, 196.9 gigawatts, take out the 24 coal, that's already a tripling of the amount of generation to current day's demand.
Yeah.
And yet we still will be keeping coal in the system. These are the sorts of things that I think the Commonwealth needs to be taking a really hard look at and starting to shake up the current regime and snap it out of this snooze that it's in, that it's not doing its job. And if you can tell me it is or demonstrate it is, I'll keep on coming back here every week to listen to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. So yes, there is a very big, transition that is underway that requires a significant amount of capital investment. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The private sector will deliver most of it without government support, but there is a need to accelerate through government support. The way I think about this is that what sits at the other side of this transition, again, the objectives: lower emissions, affordability, security, reliability. In order to get to that position and to maintain all those things all the way through the transition is a very challenging exercise, requires a lot of effort, not only at the Commonwealth level but at the state level in order to achieve that. The market bodies, we're all in terms of ensuring that this transition is a success. Every element of it needs to work well. So your points about the integrated system plan, we need that to be 100% in terms of what its contribution is. It needs to be the best possible planning document that AEMO can produce. I absolutely agree with you 100% on that. We can't afford to have any element of this transition not work well if we're going to support consumers on its way through. So I agree with your premise that we need to make sure it's a strong document. Do I have concerns that it's not serving its purpose at the moment? As I said, it continues to strengthen over time. I don't have any fundamental concerns at this stage.
I think you're right about that capital flowing to those investments. My concern is that the ISP, which is meant to be signalling where that investment goes, it's like the older analogy. If all you've got is a hammer, every problem's a nail, and to AEMO, every problem's solved by transmission, and it's not going to fix the problems of where we're trying to get to. Anyway, unless you have something else, I will let you go and let my fine fellow senators go. And thank you very much for appearing. We look forward to seeing you next week at SC.
See you Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The hearing's closed for today.